Have you ever wondered what the implications of our current economic deficit are? Today, we're going to delve into the current state of the deficit and its implications, taking a journey through time to understand how we got here. Picture this: it's 1930, and the world is in the midst of the Great Depression. The Roosevelt administration introduces the New Deal, a series of public works projects aimed at rescuing the economy after the 1929 crisis. But things get worse, and the deficit increases as a result of World War II, reaching a staggering 25% of GDP. Fast forward to the years between 1947 and 1950, and again between 1996 and 2000. For the first time, the public treasury is positive in relation to the percentage of GDP. This means that taxation revenue exceeded government spending. Between 1950 and 1973, expenses hovered around and slightly below zero. But the deficit began to increase again between the late 1970s and about 1996. This trend continued with the onset of the War on Terror following the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. Here we are today, and the deficit is worse than during the 2008 crisis. Even as we celebrate a low unemployment rate and a growth of 3.3% in the fourth quarter of 2023, the government continues to run deficits of 6% of GDP. This raises a critical question. If the government spends in such a reckless manner during prosperous times, what will happen in 2024 and 2025 if the USA enters a recession? As the yield curve of the 10-year bond suggests, we may be heading towards a doom loop, a debt crisis where the debt continues to rise because the deficit continues to increase. This could potentially lead to the supply of treasury collateral to finance the debt increasing, causing the price to fall due to the inverse relationship between price and interest. So as we can see, the deficit today is worse than during the 2008 crisis. And with unfunded federal obligations exceeding $127 trillion, according to Forbes, the stakes are higher than ever. In the midst of what is being touted as a hot economy, why is the deficit still rising? This paradox might seem strange, but it's an economic reality we're currently facing. We're in an era of low unemployment rates, with the economy reportedly growing by 3.3% in the fourth quarter of 2023. It's a period of economic prosperity, or so it seems on the surface. But let's dig a little deeper. Despite this economic growth, the government continues to run a deficit of 6% of GDP. Now, this isn't inherently a bad thing. Deficits can contribute to economic growth if they're managed well. But the key word here is managed. And right now, it seems like our deficit is not being managed at all. It's being allowed to grow, unchecked. This brings us to an interesting paradox. We've got a booming economy on one hand, and on the other, a deficit that's growing like a weed. And it's not just growing, it's growing at a rate that's faster than our economy. This is like a runner who's trying to win a race, but instead of getting closer to the finish line, they're actually moving further away from it. It's a paradox that raises a lot of questions. If the economy is doing so well, why is the government spending more than it's earning? If the unemployment rate is low and the GDP is growing, why is the deficit still rising? It's a conundrum that economists and policymakers are grappling with. But perhaps the biggest question of all is this: if the government continues this trend of spending, what will happen if we hit a recession in 2024 or 2025? This is a question that we all need to consider. Because if we continue on this path, we could be setting ourselves up for a major economic disaster. We can't keep ignoring this issue. It's time to address the elephant in the room. We need to start having conversations about our economic future and what we're going to do to ensure that it's a prosperous one, not one plagued by a ballooning deficit. It's a conversation that we can't afford to put off any longer. Let's dive into the doom loop, a cycle of debt that could potentially send us into a crisis. Imagine a scenario where debt just keeps rising, spiraling higher and higher, like a frightening roller coaster with no end in sight. That, my friends, is the doom loop. It's a situation where the deficit, the difference between what the government earns and spends, keeps growing. And with it, the national debt balloons out of control. Consider this: the government needs to finance its debt. It does so by issuing treasury collateral. But the more it issues, the more supply there is. And as we know from basic economics, when supply increases and demand remains constant, prices fall. In this context, the price falling means an increase in interest rates. But here's the catch. The interest rate isn't just a number, it's the cost of debt. So higher interest rates mean the cost of servicing the debt increases. And guess what? That increases the deficit even more. You see how this cycle, this doom loop, starts to form? Now let's throw in another wrench into the works: unfunded federal obligations. These include payments for programs like national insurance and Medicare, which are essentially promises made by the government to its citizens. These obligations are like a ticking time bomb, and according to Forbes, they exceed $127 trillion. So not only does the government have to deal with a growing deficit and increasing interest rates, but it also has this huge pile of obligations to fulfill. And all these factors feed into each other, creating a vicious cycle, a doom loop of debt that's hard to break out of. As the deficit grows, the debt grows. As the debt grows, the interest rates go up. As the interest rates go up, the deficit grows even further. And all the while, the unfunded obligations are still there, looming large. That's the doom loop for you. The doom loop paints a grim picture, but what exacerbates this situation is the potential flood of government debt. As we grapple with rising debt, another problem looms: decreasing demand for U.S. Treasury securities. This is not a small issue by any means. It's like a storm gathering on the horizon, and it has the potential to turn our economic landscape upside down. The heart of this problem lies in the changing global economic dynamics. It's no secret that the world is shifting, and so are the traditional power structures. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are emerging as significant players on the global stage. They're not just growing rapidly, they're also reshaping the global financial system. And one of the ways they're doing this is by developing their own currency. This new currency could very well challenge the dollar's dominance. It may seem like a far-off possibility now, but the seeds have been sown, and the implications could be monumental. If the world starts moving away from the dollar, the demand for U.S. Treasury securities could take a hit. After all, these securities are dollar-denominated, and if the dollar loses its luster, so does the appeal of these securities. The potential loss of the petrodollar status adds another layer of complexity to the issue. The petrodollar system, which sees global oil transactions conducted in US dollars, has been a cornerstone of our economy for decades. It has helped maintain the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency. But what happens if countries like Saudi Arabia start selling oil in other currencies? This could further decrease the demand for US Treasury securities. And in a world where we're grappling with rising deficits and debt, this could spell trouble. We could find ourselves in a situation where the government is issuing more debt than there are willing buyers, leading to higher interest rates and further exacerbating our debt problem. Decreasing demand for U.S. Treasury securities and the potential loss of the petrodollar status could spell trouble for our economy. But understanding these challenges is the first step towards navigating them. After all, it's only in understanding the storm that we can find a way to weather it. So what does all this mean for our economy and us? We've journeyed through the increasing deficit, from Roosevelt's New Deal in the 30s to the War on Terror in the early noughties. We've seen how, despite periods of surplus, our deficit today is higher than during the 2008 crisis, even in the face of a seemingly hot economy with low unemployment and reported growth. This paradox of a hot economy continues to baffle us. Despite positive economic indicators, the government continues to run deficits of 6% of GDP. It raises the question, what might happen if the U.S. enters a recession in 2024 or 2025? Looking at the yield curve of the 10-year bond, it's a real possibility. And if that happens, it could potentially increase the deficit to levels beyond even those of the Second World War. This brings us to the doom loop, a debt crisis where the deficit and debt continue to spiral upwards. As the government issues more treasury collateral to finance the debt, the price falls due to the inverse relationship between price and interest. This leads to higher interest rates to pay the debt, further increasing the deficit and feeding the debt bubble. And let's not forget the unfunded federal obligations exceeding $127 trillion, as reported by Forbes. Finally, we looked at the potential flood of government debt hitting the market and the decreasing demand for U.S. Treasury securities. Information about a BRICS currency challenging the dollar for global hegemony and the loss of the petrodollar status is increasing. To wrap up, we're navigating through choppy economic waters. The increasing deficit, the paradox of a hot economy, the looming doom loop, and the decreasing demand for U.S. Treasury securities all have significant implications. These factors underscore the need to understand the intricacies of our economy and the role of the deficit. As we navigate through these economic challenges, it becomes increasingly important to understand the intricacies of our economy and the implications of the deficit.